Hi there, I'm Chris from Beeproject Apiaries. We're an apiary located in the city of Winnipeg. That means that we take care of honeybees here in the city. We're here today in support of the Canadian Mental Health Association's Ride Don't Hide fundraiser. We are here to try and help, as they do, to draw awareness for mental health. The Canadian Mental Health Association promotes a lot of advocacy, supports and resources for people suffering from mental health and issues, and helps all Canadians flourish and live a full life. So today, as part of that, we're going to take you through some basics about honeybees. If you do decide that you want to support the initiatives of the Ride Don't Hide fundraiser, the overall goal is to raise $70,000 in Manitoba to support the mental health work. That means that if each Manitoban donated $20 and there was 20,000 Manitobans that did it, we would exceed the goal for fundraising. So please consider that. Okay, so now let's talk about honeybees. So honeybees are the European honeybee, is the most common pollinator in the world. It's used extensively to pollinate our crops. And so that means that the bees visit flowers and move pollen from one flower to another. It helps flowers produce seeds, fruit, vegetables, nuts, all because the bees are essentially allowing the flowers to participate in sexual reproduction by moving that pollen from flower to flower. So they're really essential to our food security. As a beekeeper, you learn a lot about the basics of bees, and although all bees and pollinators are important, the honeybee is the one that we kind of specialize in. So I'm going to hop into some details about the honeybee. Inside a honeybee hive, we have three groups or castes of bees. We have a little hive behind us so that you guys can kind of see. We're going to work through that hive afterwards, and we're going to talk about what beekeepers need to be looking at when they look through a hive. So the first thing that everybody thinks of when they think of honeybees is, of course, honey. But for people, the more important part is the food production from our fruits and vegetables that we were talking about from pollination. So yes, these produce honey, and not all bees or pollinators do. Only about 7 species of honeybees really exist in the world, and there's like 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And in Canada, there's over 800 different species of pollinating bees. So in our honeybee hive, we have the 3 castes. The one that most people think of is the queen. This is a blown up picture of a queen. She has a large abdomen or tail, and in that she has some really hyper-developed ovaries. Her main job is laying eggs, and she can lay about 1,500 eggs per day at this time in the summer. That's a crazy amount of eggs, and if you piled them in a pile and weighed them, it would weigh as much as her in one day's work, which is crazy. She can't do other jobs for the hive. She doesn't protect the hive. She doesn't gather nectar or pollen or pollinate. She really just lays eggs. She also creates something called pheromones, which we'll touch on later. These are odors that the bees communicate with. The second group of bees, which are also female, and there will be thousands and thousands of them in a hive, are the worker bees. The worker bees can protect the hive, so they're the ones that use their stingers or drive away other insects by kind of intimidating them. They live only about 6 weeks in summer, and they are not able to lay eggs that will become bees, worker bees. So they help the queen, they take care of her, they protect the hive, pollinate the flowers, all the jobs. That's why they're called workers. So they literally work nonstop. And then the last one is the drones. So these are the male bees, and actually they look like bumblebees kind of. They're rounder, larger, and they fly kind of goofy or dopey like a bumblebee does through the air. They don't pollinate. They don't protect the hive. They don't even have a stinger. And their only job is to hopefully mate with a queen once in their life and then die afterwards. And if they are alive still at the end of the season, the worker bees will drive them out of the hive, or most of them out of the hive, so that they don't take up food resources and space during the harsh winters. So within a hive, the queen, going back to the large queen, which is here, you guys probably are already aware that there's only one queen per hive. And that's quite important. In normal circumstances, there's only one queen per hive. And then in the springtime, the worker bees, the female worker bee, will have about 10 to 15,000 bees at this time. And they'll grow to be about 50,000 bees in the peak of summer. And then the last one, the drone, they usually make up 1 or 2% of the hive. So there's a few hundred usually in the spring in a hive, and maybe 1,000 at the peak of summer. And as a beekeeper, one of the things that is our primary goal is to make sure that the health of the colony is in check. So we're coming regularly every 1 to 2 weeks to look through the hive, and we routinely want to see if the queen is in good health, if she's laying well, if the bees seem to be working together, if there's any signs or symptoms of diseases. So really, and then do they have enough food and resources to take them through to the next check? And so really, as a beekeeper, you're sort of a steward of checking in on their health. So it's like a little health check every couple weeks, and you're kind of the guide, trying to guide them in the right direction. Obviously, the bees are the ones that do the work, and you're there to just do little interventions along the way if needed, but you don't want to try and do too much. So the bees, as they have this huge team and workforce, they have to have ways to communicate, whether to communicate their needs or food resources, or to know whether or not the queen is healthy. They need ways to communicate with each other, but of course they can't talk. So when we go and see little kids, we often say, how do the bees speak to each other? And they say, oh, they buzz. Well, they do buzz, but as far as scientists and people are aware, the buzzing doesn't really mean anything. What they do is they have about 3 well-documented ways of communicating. The first is with pheromones, and we spoke about that just a second ago. Pheromones are odors or scents that the bees give off to communicate something to the other bees. So the queen has a special pheromone, queen pheromone. A lot of the names in beekeeping of different things are not overly creative or artistic. They're very utilitarian. So the queen pheromone is produced by the queen if she's in a healthy state. And if the queen either dies or becomes unhealthy, the production of that pheromone usually drops. And that allows the bees to cue in that they need to start making a new queen. So when it's absent, it's very important and cues them in to try to nourish a very young larva, so a baby bee, with something called royal jelly. And the royal jelly is a special food that's very rich in nutrients and helps the larva grow into a queen instead of a worker. The normal food that a bee would receive doesn't have as rich protein and fats, and so they just become worker bees. There's a helicopter or something. So the queen pheromone, if it's absent, will cause the bees to feed the larva the royal jelly and produce a queen. The queen pheromone has also been shown to help the bees work in an organized way as a team or a group. And then there's a very important pheromone for the beekeeper, and that's called panic pheromone. When the bees get upset, they give off a smell, and the smell is really close to bananas, the smell of really ripe bananas. So sometimes if you leave a banana in your hot vehicle and it stinks up the car like banana, I almost get worried that there's an angry bee in the car. So we are aware of this pheromone, and we use something called a smoker to cover that smell. The panic pheromone will cause other bees to get upset. So if you're working through a hive or you're opening in it and you need to check on the hive, you use a smoker to help keep them calm, and so they won't become agitated or feel like they need to sting in order to protect the hive. And that's why we're able to go through the hive without the bees getting too upset. And the nice thing about the tool that we use to cover up panic pheromone, it's this tool right here, it's a smoker, is that the way that we're covering it disappears quickly after we leave, and so the function of the hive can go kind of right back to normal. The other way that the bees are communicating is through something that humans use, which is sharing. So if the bees want to communicate that they've got a really good food source, such as a field of dandelions, they will come home to the hive, and those will be the females because they're the ones that collect nectar and pollen, and they will share the nectar with another bee. The funny thing is they actually regurgitate, so like barf up the nectar to share. So in order to share the nectar and encourage other bees to go out and find that same nectar to bring back to make into honey or to feed their larvae with, the bees regurgitate. They barf up that nectar. And the funny thing is, in our mind, we're like, oh, they like barf it onto the floor and that's all disgusting. But the bees have a specialized tongue called a proboscis. It's shaped like a straw, and they roll it up in their mouth, similar to a butterfly. So they roll out this big thing, and the bees come right up to each other, and they share, just like they're sharing a Slurpee, almost out of the same container. And I'm so glad that when we share, don't barf up what we're sharing for others. And usually we get to joke around a lot with the kids whose schools we work at, talking about pollination and the barfing and stuff. But the neat thing is there's actually some science that's going on when they do that. There's special enzymes within the stomachs or the honey crop of the bees. And every time that nectar is consumed by a bee and then shared again, it's getting mixed with enzymes. And they help the sugars, which are found in the nectar, to be converted into the sugars that are in honey. And so it starts helping with the preservation of the natural preservation of the nectar as honey. And then those bees will take that nectar and go and pack it away in the honeycomb to start the process of making honey. So the third way that's well documented about how bees are communicating is another way that humans sometimes try to communicate with, which is by dancing. So I'm going to show you the most common bee dance. It's called the Waggle Dance. I'm going to show you the most common way that the bees would dance to communicate. It's called the Waggle Dance, and it's pretty well known. Like, kids will know about it and stuff, and you can see little videos on YouTube about it. But essentially, it's called waggle because the hips of the bees are going like this. So they're waggling back and forth, and the intensity or quickness of those waggles is important. The harder or faster that the bee is waggling, the better the bee thinks that nectar is. So better source of food. If they're going slow, like a lazy old man waggle, the other bees aren't getting very excited about it. But if they're intensely waggling, the bees start paying attention and want to listen up through watching the dance to what the bee's trying to tell them. So they will waggle. And the second part is that they're walking while they waggle. So they walk, walk, walk. And the distance that they walk in a straight line while they waggle also communicates to the bees how far they need to fly from the hive to find the nectar source. So if they waggle a very short distance, just like that, then the bees will think that it's right outside the hive, so to speak. And if they waggle for quite a while moving forward, the bees will know they really have to fly a ways. And actually, that brings up an interesting point. Honeybees are known to fly up to 2 miles from their hive in order to find foodstuff. So to find flowers, they can fly, if needed, up to 2 miles. So the bee will keep doing this waggle, and they curl around. They stop waggling for a second, they curl around and get back to where they started, and then they waggle again. And they, for some reason, switch sides. So it looks like a figure 8 and this kind of waggling figure 8. So this is the Waggle Dance. So that's sort of the third way that the bees are communicating. And the the direction that they dance within the hive also communicates to the bees what direction they will need to fly from the hive in order to find the food. So it's a very amazing thing that they use to communicate. And there's actually documented 5 to 7 different varieties of dances that the bees are using, which tell their sisters or the rest of the hive important information. Pretty cool. Okay, so we reached the part where we're going to light the smoker and go into the hive a little bit. So My two most important tools as a beekeeper are my hive tool, which is essentially a tiny kind of crowbar, and then my smoker. The smoker is basically a canister with a bellow on it. And I guess part of this tool that you need is a fire source. I just dropped my lighter, hang on. All right, that wasn't so smooth, but I got my lighter. When we're in the city, we often only have 1 to 4 hives in a location, often just 1 or 2. And so we don't want to burn fuel that's going to last for a super long time, because we'll have to drive to another location, or we'll have to get off the roof and go back through the building. So we use cardboard. It burns cool because we don't want to heat the bees. We just want smoke, and it's very easy to put out. Some beekeepers in the countryside will use things like oak chips or different fuel sources for their smoker. And we basically use this or long dried up grass. So we get the cardboard going, and we put it in here once it's well caught. Got our lid on there. Got our hive tool. And because you got to look super cool while you're going through your hive, we've got our sunglasses. This is our backyard hive. Another name for the hive is a colony. So this is one colony of bees, or one hive of bees. Inside this hive right now, there will be several thousand bees. And like we talked, how many queens? 1 queen. And there will be some drone bees, mostly workers though. Right now, the bees are having a total heyday with all the dandelions, the apple blossoms, the pears, lilacs, all kinds of things that have been blooming. And so that means that they're busily at work and they're quite active. I'm gonna smoke the entrances like I did, and then I crack open the lid with my hive tool, and I'm gonna smoke it again. Now, I took out a couple of frames from the box already to give me some space, but usually there's 10 frames within the hive, within what we call the brood chamber. The bottom box is called the brood chamber, and it's where the queen is laying her eggs, and the bees will be taking care of the young larvae. So they'll be feeding them, they'll be cleaning, they'll be grooming the queen. And this chamber is really packed with nectar because of all of those floral sources. This is a frame of bees. And as a beekeeper, you're often looking past the bees at the honeycomb. You're looking into the holes for signs of eggs, signs of disease, and also for food. But obviously there's a lot of bees on there, so that you're looking at as well. This hive recently went through the process of making new queen. You can see there's a large kind of chunk of comb there. That was a queen cell, these things that hang down. So the queen is just at the age where she's gonna start laying. This is fresh nectar that they've been making and turning into honey. So this is very strong tasting because of the strong tasting nectars in the spring. Every flower has its own type of color to its nectar as well as flavor. Yeah. Yeah, very sweet, but super flavorful. So today I'm looking to see that the queen hatched out properly, which it looks like she did. The bees are happy and they're working. They're really packing in the nectar here. So we're gonna put in those other 2 frames at the end and make sure that they have somewhere to keep laying eggs when the queen starts. Here we have a frame that has capped brood. So underneath these little brown cappings, we could almost consider like they're cocoons. The larva, a single egg, is laid in each hole, and then it hatches and a little larva is there. It's fed by the bees. It looks like a tiny, tiny worm, and it grows until it's almost filling the cell. And then the bees will cap them over with these papery cappings, and they will finish their life process. So they will become, they will get hairs and skin pigments. They will get color, and their wings will develop properly. And then they will chew their way out. Another neat thing on this frame is you can see some pollen that's packed in here. So these different oranges and browns, that's important. The bees use the pollen for protein, and it's actually all down the side of the frame here. So this is looking really great. And they need to keep them warm, so it's easier to produce baby bees, basically, when it's warmer out. Some of the pests that we're looking for are things like tiny insects. One is called a varroa mite. The varroa mites are one of these, like almost like a wood tick would be for humans. So it's a small kind of red insect that attaches to the bees and really compromises their immune system by sucking the energy from them. And then when the varroa mite is ready to reproduce, it crawls into the hole, the honeycomb holes, and eats the food and the larva that the bees are bringing, and then it's capped over and it will do its life cycle in there, its reproduction. So they're very hard on the bees, and it's one of the reasons that there's been such a big collapse of bee populations, honeybee populations around the world. And that was a pest that was originally brought in by accident just through shipping and stuff from Asia. So another disease that we're looking for is one that stops the larva from developing properly. So it's not a little insect that we can see, but it's sometimes it's a bacterial or fungal things that you're looking for in the hive. There's all kinds of little health conditions to know about. But it's fun when you're looking through a healthy hive, and as a beekeeper, when you learn about how to manage those things, you can really lose yourself going through the hive. You kind of go on to bee time, and sometimes you can spend an hour in the hive and not even realize. Right now, because it's a smaller colony, it's pretty quick to go through, but this colony will grow and reach that 50,000 bees in the summertime. And in the city here, our colonies usually bring in up to about 100 pounds of honey. But in the countryside, the average is more like 160 pounds of honey. So the countryside can make a little more honey. We get really interesting flavors and unique kind of colors and stuff from our honeys in the city. So it's a fun way to experience Winnipeg and your community. But it's not really about honey production when Beeproject places hives in the city. It's more about engaging citizens and being aware about the bees, being aware that we need to plant flowers and habitat for them. And one of the other things that was shown to have a big impact on both honeybees but wild pollinators are lack of habitat and chemical use, so sprays for gardens or farms and stuff. And having the honeybee hives close by has really motivated people to address those things. So we think it's a great way to get people motivated how to protect them. And also it shows how interconnected everything in nature sort of is. People and the things we rely on for our health, as well as wild creatures and stuff. I do want to point out a couple drone bees. So they're here. They're a bit bigger and fatter, and they'll be walking around much less purposefully. Oh, he won't stay in my hand. The drones are fun to play with because it's to remind you they don't have those stingers. And there's a few on this side too. And then the worker bees are these smaller ones that people think look a little more like wasps with their very obvious stripes. There will be about 15 bees or so that mate with the queen, and the rest, and then she will only mate for one period of her life, which is at the beginning of her life, and she will hold enough bees. She will only need to mate for that period, but she'll be able to lay fertilized eggs for her entire kind of 3-year productive life. So the queen will live about 3 years and be able to lay well for that period of time. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for coming and going through the hive with us. And we'd like to remind you to consider supporting the Canadian Mental Health Association through a donation. And if you are having any mental health issues of your own, remember to access their resources. and supports. Have a great day. Bye.